Hi, and welcome everybody to Talks at Google. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Brian Solis, who is the author of What's the Future of Business, WTF. He's a well-renowned digital analyst, author, and has a great blog. I also encourage you to go visit my personal favorite at go/Shaq Brian, which is a great interview of Brian giving an interview to Shaquille O'Neal. So without further ado, I'll let Brian take it away.
Thanks, Nathan. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for spending the Friday with me before a long weekend. I'm a digital analyst. I study technology and its impact on business. And on nights and weekends, I like to say that I'm an aspiring digital anthropologist. I like to look at how technology is impacting you and me, and how it starts to change sort of who we are, forms of self-expression, how we communicate with one another, and ultimately how that makes us or helps us or improves or changes the way that we make decisions. Because in that world between analysis and anthropology is a greater understanding of how to sort of get in front of how we're changing. And nothing really says change and innovation and transformation as much as a PowerPoint presentation. Now that I think about it, with a small room, that's probably not the best choice. But I will just kind of flip through some slides, and then I'd love to just sort of hear your questions. One of the things that I find most fascinating is that when I'm not working with technology companies, I'm working with big brands and enterprise organizations to help them figure out how to embrace innovation and technology as a way of improving engagement, whether it's with customers, whether it's with employees, whether it's using technology as a way to improve products or processes or services. And what's consistent in almost every case is this inability to really understand the role that people play in the whole process. Technology is part of it, but things like transparency, communication, empowerment, listening to people, thinking about the problems that they have and how to improve those processes that contribute to the problems or the products that contribute to the problems. None of this really is part of the decision-making cycle at the enterprise executive level. I actually believe this contributes to what I call digital Darwinism. Technology and society are evolving, just a reality. And a lot of businesses and organizations and governments aren't evolving along with it. And that creates a problem where we're trying to solve it with technology, where we will say networks, tablets, smartphones. These are all ways that we're communicating, so therefore the answer has to lie with the device or has to lie with the network. When in fact, it's more cultural, it's more human. Understanding this difference. I don't know, if I was a relationship counselor, you would talk to somebody in a marriage and say, well, there's what you said and there's what they heard. And often they're different. So allowing yourself to step outside of, say, you, and think more about the people, the markets, the opportunities, allow you to see things in a very different light. I'm not sure if anybody has watched that show, Undercover Boss, but it's one of my favorite shows. Even though it has the same exact ending every episode, there's a beauty in the validation that happens at the end. It's sort of this gift of empathy that executives get from having to walk in the footsteps of their customers or their employees, and in turn seeing essentially what it is that they had missed all along. They'll always say the same thing too. They'll say, I forgot what it was like. And that's important, because when you start to remember what it's like, or when you get to see what the challenge or the problem is, you probably heard of the book, The Innovator's Dilemma. You sort of play on words and you realize it's the dilemma's innovator that can pave a way to a brighter, more meaningful future, where empathy plays a key role in all of this. What it all nets out to is that yes, technology is pervasive. It's part of our everyday life now. And when you post a selfie on your favorite network of choice, and you don't get as many reactions as you hoped, that affects you. So you do it again, or you find a more interesting way to evoke that type of engagement or reaction that validates why you did it in the first place. And as we start to do this, there's a self-empowerment in the process. You place yourself at the center of everything. I call it the ecosystem, and I use that word lovingly, where you are literally at the center of your universe, where people, businesses, anything that's important to you sort of revolves around you, and you too revolve around the other things that are important to you. Why is this important? Because at the center of all of this, understanding this human algorithm, what makes us tick, what's important to us, how are we changing, and how are we forcing others to change around us, I believe requires not only study, but innovation. So I brought some of these books that I'm going to leave behind for anybody that has a long drive this weekend or a flight, because I want to share my story with you. I wish I had more time in the world. If I did, I would fix how we teach kids in school, because we're adapting old processes to new ways of thinking. And it's almost the same problem across the board, whether it's government or business. It's just that we're taking what we know and we're trying to stuff what's new into old processes and methodologies. And I thought, wow, well, look, I'm an author. This is, I think, my 6th or 7th book. There is no way I could sit down and write another 400-page business book. I just can't. In the last year and a half since I published my last book, a lot's happened, right? I'm part of maybe too many networks, definitely tethered to too many devices, in good ways. But just my ability to think and write, consume, it's now more bursting than it is consistent or continual, like the way it used to be. It's not a bad thing. I actually think I've learned more in the process. So then I started to think about textbooks and kids and how they learn or how they're having difficulty learning, and how maybe we're prescribing medication to them to get them to focus rather than maybe innovating in ways that help them focus their way. So I thought about the book, the concept of a book, and decided, why would I write a book the same old way on the same old paper with the same old font when I could and should develop a book that would be the way I would want to consume it, or the way a younger millennial or Gen Z would want to consume it. And so I spent about a year or so studying UX and design, and studying how you and I read on tablets and how we read on smartphones, and what makes us share, what becomes something that's shareable, what makes us engage with the piece of content. And the idea of a book went out the window. The idea then of an analog app started to come into view. And how I wrote, the way I wrote a sentence, how I would bring a paragraph together, when I would not opt for a paragraph and go for a visual instead. Thinking about what a table of contents means and why there wouldn't be a navigation bar as you turn the pages. It started to make more sense that if I was trying to innovate for the sake of innovation, it might miss the target. If I was trying to innovate based on the dilemma, you start to see greater opportunity, greater clarity through empathy. And so this is why I believe that the future of innovation actually lies at the center of, say, data science and social science. Because essentially, the people that we're trying to connect with, the people that matter to us, well, they have an audience of their own, and their audience has an audience of their own. And they live in this ecosystem where they don't have to step outside of it. It's fulfilling to them. It's fulfilling to us. We capture experiences, we share experiences that are important to us. And if anything isn't making a correlation in this regard, then you're missing an opportunity to extend your reach, to extend your value, your purpose, your mission. And when I talk to businesses, a lot of them will sit there and say, we get what you're saying, so we think the answer then is going to be in technology, and then also better understanding millennials. So we're bringing on millennial marketers, we're bringing on folks in HR who better understand millennials, and you realize, cool, all right, But it's not just about an age group. It's about behavior. And I refer to this greater connected society as Generation C, where the C stands for connected. And the reason I do that is because when you study how, say, a 49-year-old uses their tablet, their social network, and their smartphone, they start to exhibit millennial-like behaviors. My mother, for example, is, I believe, a millennial at heart. She's too connected, she's too social, and sometimes I've had to consider blocking her because of how active she is in tagging posts and pictures and what have you. But in that regard, though, the way that she makes decisions has also changed. She's watching television with her tablet. She's sharing things in real time. She's capturing and sharing experiences. So to her, what becomes important has to fly through the stream, has to fly through her network. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a billboard or a print magazine or on a television show or commercial. So the idea is just segregating by age or demographic. Sure, it makes sense in some regards, but I think if we look at behavior, there's a bigger opportunity, because behavior, by the way, I mean, you just add colors to this bike. I see that driving up and down the street all the time. It's a very talented move, if you ask me. But in reality, technology just becomes an extension of who we are at all times. I hear parents here, I interviewed Katie Couric for my web show, and she just sort of talked about the frustration she has, for example, of being a parent and trying to get her kids to look away from the smartphone during dinner or to put the phone down while they're watching TV or movies. And essentially, what we're trying to do is force people to go through their lives in the way that we grew up, in the way that we learned, when in fact, it is us, I think, who have to learn. Look, I am not a millennial. I like to pretend I am, though. When you look at how a young child approaches a flat screen television, it's natural for them to want to pinch and zoom and swipe. If you hand them a remote control, there is just absolutely no way that would make sense in any type of intuition of why you need so many buttons to control that thing. And then if you look at how many controls you have just in the living room alone, it just doesn't make as much sense. And what we're starting to do is take this philosophy, processes of how we make decisions, why we're making decisions, and you come back to that Undercover Boss TV series and you realize that the people making decisions about the future welfare of the business, the company, the government, the livelihood of whatever it touches, they're making these decisions based on life as they know it, not life as they don't. And this is why I believe that thinking that, I laugh when I see this picture, but the reality is that to them, that is the best party ever. And so better understanding why that moment is shareable and why they're connected to their device, and to figure out how to capture attention and to be part of that moment, requires a completely different process leading up to it. How you talk, how you engage, how you keep people engaged, how you understand what they're trying to do, and how you help facilitate what they're trying to do. What you realize is essentially you're just solving for yourself, because this is as much about trying to get your attention as it is trying to be relevant to a person who has different needs, different expectations, right? Because the more that you become connected, the more you become informed. The more you become informed, the more you become empowered. And the more you become empowered, the more demanding you become, right? Real time, personalization. You're at the center of all of this, and if things aren't meeting your needs or expectations, you share that with your greater network. You let those around you know. There used to be a joke that only social media experts have problems with airlines. And the joke is because you hear about it all the time when they're tweeting at United or JetBlue or Southwest, my flight's delayed 5 minutes, WTF. Really? It's not really a problem. Sometimes it's a problem. But the reality is that businesses don't even know what to do with that, right? Oh, we're so sorry. Here's an 800 number. Call us. Or here's an email address. Call us. That's not going to happen, because that's not the way that I work. And if we want to connect, we can't think about channels as being ways for us to talk at you, for us to come up with some beautiful brand or some story or some value proposition and stuff it into as many channels with as little effort as possible. I actually believe that when we innovate based on problems, based on behavior, it's like looking at the remote control. You start to see that the way things are and the way things could be are in fact different. The fact that businesses, decision makers in general still think that we make decisions in a linear fashion around a funnel is funny. So much so that I call it a cluster funnel, because it's this great sort of masquerade. The persuasion, think of that as marketing or branding, some clever, creative, gorgeous ad. It's to persuade you to think about us, and then we have some deal, some hook, some incentive to bring you in to the point where you have to exchange with us something, whether it's a vote, whether it's money, what have you. And then once we have you, there's always a great distance. We don't need you. And if you need us, well, we have processes for you then to start to try to engage with us. But we might need you at some point. We have a new product. We have a new initiative that needs a vote. So we call that the re-enchantment. And after the re-enchantment, we just place you into this governance system that is either CRM or some database that's falling apart. But there's just no way to keep you informed or engaged, to build a relationship that goes beyond the transaction. In the 90s, there was a book called The Experience Economy that a friend of mine, Joe Pine, wrote. He said, if you think about being in the business of products, you're going to fail over time. If you think about being in the experience business, where a product is one of the things that brings an experience to life, then that represents the future of engagement. And I actually believe that's true, because if you think about what it is that we share in all of these networks across all of these devices, they're always experiences. It's very experiential. It's a very emotional landscape in which we've woven through this technology, through devices. We share what we love, we share what we hate, we share what's meh. Connecting in that way, then you start to see that an emotional layer, an experiential layer is required to be defined by you and lived through by those who are important to you. It's more of a journey, not a funnel, where everything that, say, related to Google, related to any business, related to anything, are stitched together based on shared experiences before, during, and after transactions. Always. It doesn't go away. It's not Snapchat. These experiences don't self-destruct. They start to culminate, much like a Google index, for example. And these shared experiences are always on, always available. Think about the lazy web for a moment. Some people won't even use Google search. They'll just go right to their network of choice and say, I'm thinking about, does anyone know, can anyone recommend, so that they could bring the answers to them without leaving one particular window. And when we get those answers, we're forced to walk in these steps, in these click paths, in these journeys that are defined for an old way of thinking, a linear flow that just doesn't work. It's almost like the remote control. It serves a purpose, but we're forcing people to use something and do things our way, not a way that's more natural. And I dug up a very interesting report from the Google Insights team. It was called The Multi-Screen World, that I thought was pretty interesting. And it studied how people made decisions and how those decisions sort of came to life across screens. Were they able to complete something with one screen? Did they have to screen hop? Did they complement one another? And what this told me was, aside from how people are using it, they're using every device differently. And what if we could better understand what the nature of that screen was, what the intention of that screen was, what the intention of that outcome would be, and then redesign the UI, the UX around everything so that it's efficient, it's natural, it's native. I'm not sure how many of you have read the book, The Clue Train Manifesto. I think they came out 10 or 11 years ago. And in the book, the authors talked about how the future was going to be driven by conversations, that all markets were conversations, and at some point those conversations would become more powerful, more defining than any effort you could do in terms of branding or marketing or influence. When I think about that, they were so right that it's not just about conversations. Really what it's about is this idea that conversations are expressions of experiences. The future of markets, business, education, what have you, is all driven by experience. And I was inspired by Google's work around the zero moment of truth a couple years ago. And for those who don't know the zero moment of truth, it's this idea that when something captures your attention, you're going to essentially Google it to learn more about it. What I found fascinating about that was it was just one of a series of moments of truth. You take away the funnel, you take away the journey, you take away this idea of conversations, and you just realize that as a consumer, as a human being, when we want to make a decision, there are just 4 moments of truth that happen that affect how we make a decision and how in turn we affect how other people make a decision. What I found fascinating though is what happens in a world where maybe we don't have our laptop first, right? Maybe Google.com isn't the first place we go. Maybe we go to another Google property like YouTube because maybe it's easier to look up a video on a smartphone than it is a website. I, for one, for example, can't even read a product manual anymore. I can't even read websites anymore just because they're not necessarily written for human beings. They're written for the people who signed off on the check to pay for the design. For example, I'm a big photographer. I love digital SLRs. I just picked up a new camera recently. I was wowed by the beauty of their advertisements. When I opened up the box and I looked at the manual, I swear it was created in 1927. It was illustrated poorly. Sorry, I'm not going to say the brand because it's on video, but I had to go to YouTube in order to figure out what I needed to do. And I couldn't find any videos by the manufacturer. Instead, I found videos from other people like me who couldn't find answers, who answered questions, who demonstrated capabilities. It's fascinating to me that in that moment of truth, the company was saved because it had committed consumers, people who cared enough to actually use the channels the right way. So what if we were thoughtful in the approach to say, look, I understand you're not going to find what you need, you're not going to like this manual, so we're going to give you other options, and we're not going to just rely upon you to add to the ecosystem to find solutions. We understand you're going to go around, right? Google research shows that every year the number of touch points seems to grow, often doubles, because they can, because technology is pervasive, it's everywhere. But what keeps coming back in those moments of truth aren't the things that we think they are, not the things that we're designing like websites and long forms of copy and collateral. It's all experiences, the experiences people have and the experiences people share. For example, as an author, I have to rely, whether I like it or not, on Amazon reviews, on iTunes reviews, on just reviews in general, more than I can rely on my own website for the book. More people are going to believe what you say rather than what I say. So if I know that, why wouldn't I start to work with my own teams or my own consumers to build an ecosystem that when someone asks a question in Google, or if somebody puts a series of keywords in YouTube, for example, why would I leave it to surprise or to chance in what comes back in those moments of truth? Why wouldn't I design that moment of truth? Much in the same way that we design SEO or SEM. So if we could work with people to design the experiences that we want them to have, that we want them to share, wouldn't it be fascinating in that world where we know what comes back when a question's asked? So I'm just going to kind of jump ahead, because I think the future of anything that we do is about creating experiences. Because if you can design an experience that people need or that they expect, or that we understand the problems that they have today and we could design something that solves for it, then we could merge the world of, well, the real world and the virtual world into one that becomes useful, right? It's not just a utility, it's experiential. So I think about, I'm a geek, so I think about stuff like this, The Matrix or Inception. The one thing that both of those movies had was an architect, this person who was responsible for designing the landscape. Right? You still were you, and you still moved through this landscape, but they created a world that was important to you, that you could navigate or would want to navigate around. And that is sort of the way I think about experiences, because in what I call the ultimate moment of truth, you're going to experience something. Like if I don't like a product manual, I'm going to share that I don't like a product manual, because I'm going to search, I'm going to ask questions. That experience that you have every step of the journey, before, during, and after a transaction, is something that's shared. It's something that's indexed, it's something that's findable, and if we're not designing what that experience could be, we don't only leave it to chance for what is shared actually becomes the culmination of your brand, right? A brand is not a logo, it's an ethos. It is what it represents, it's what it symbolizes. We would often try to complement a brand with a vision statement or mission statement. With my last book, I read about 1,500 of those, and I found 3 that were really meaningful, like human, that actually spoke to me, like, oh, I see where you're trying to go. I think that vision is something I can align with. But in a world where experiences become you, there's always an experience divide. There's this brand promise, right? What you say you're going to do, what you say I should have as a customer or as a stakeholder or as part of your community. And then there's the experience that I actually have. What I actually have and what I share, the more this happens, the more connected we become, the more reality it is. It's the truth. And this transparency starts to become a way of life. This truth then is not anything you can manipulate, you can try to influence or steer. It's something you have to aspire to create. And I think this is a great thing, right? I don't know how many of you have heard of or used the Pebble watch, but I was following that Kickstarter program when it shattered all the records. I was an early Kickstarter backer for this product, well, a whole bunch of products, because I think it's fun. But what it promised sounded amazing, so amazing that a lot of people backed it. What the real experience was, however, was very different. And the most common complaint, other than the screen dying, was the company never responding to anybody. And now you have this brand promise and a real world series of experiences that affect what I'm going to do as a new customer, right? These reviews, these experiences really start to influence whether or not you're going to follow in the same footsteps willfully, or if you're going to rely on your peers to help you make a decision. And in an emotional world, this is true for Amazon, this is from Best Buy. What's true about emotional experiences when they're shared is they're either a 5 or they're a 1. The 5s are people who believe in the promise. The 1s are people who didn't believe the promise and who had a different experience. The 1s can become 3s, 4s, or 5s with engagement, with learning, understanding how that experience failed to meet expectations and how to fix that. So all of the complaints from people who said that the company didn't care, didn't listen, didn't follow up, well, there's a way to fix that. And anytime somebody tries to fix anything, a natural thing happens. It's called reciprocity. You're actually thankful. You actually appreciate that somebody reached out, heard you, listened to you, and it changes how you feel about things. Often, you actually change your review, you share something publicly, you tell people that you heard from them, and that's important. And at the same time, it's a sad state of the world when you actually get help and it's that transforming. But That's a whole nother discussion. So I believe that the future of shared experiences isn't just about innovation or coming up with ideas or finding ways to use technology to just be ahead of the curve. I actually think that the greatest form of innovation is when you are the dilemma's innovator. There are a lot of problems in the world that I think create a lot of opportunities, and with that, those opportunities can be inspired by, enhanced by empathy. The world, I think, every decision maker, every leader in the world, every manager in the world could use that undercover boss moment because it's inspiring. It makes you think differently, it makes you see differently. And that's the point, because when you can see things differently, when you can feel things differently, you are living in an experience layer. A layer, by the way, I believe that is user defined. This is entitled How Computers Are Born. I thought it was funny, but more importantly, it was a visualization that got me to see differently. And that is, whether it's a business, whether it's a government, whether you're an author, if you try to think about what it is you're creating or delivering and what it takes to bring that to life, when you start with empathy and thinking for a different type of person, you find that the end result, the outcome, the deliverable, whatever it is different than if you try to approach it with iteration or just pure innovation. And I think this is complementary to ways that we do things today, or it's revolutionary and just completely usurping how we do things today. To get this, by the way, it wasn't like I called the publisher and said, hey, you know, I need you to not print the book the way you usually do. I have a whole different shape and I need different paper. Can you guys find a different printing press too? And what do you guys usually pay for printing each copy of the book? Because I'm going to need you to like triple it. It was a very, very painful conversation to have. In fact, the whole idea of the design delayed the book by 6 or 8 months, to the point where I was going to give up. But thinking differently about what you're trying to do and why it's important, that's purpose. And purpose is contagious. And I believe when you start with that, only good things can come out of it. But at the very least, what ends up happening is this idea of relevance. Relevance becomes an outcome because you're considering every aspect of it. The brand experience, the user experience, the customer experience, where the one thing that ties them all together is experience. It was thoughtful, it was designed, it was reinforced, and it was connected. So what I'd just love to close out with, and if you have any questions, we'll throw it to you, is this idea, though, that innovation isn't something that has to be driven by technology. Innovation is something that I actually believe is most meaningful and most relevant when it's something that you feel. And it's something that inspires you, because that part inspires those around you. And I only just started on my path or my journey to rethinking the way that I would do things, right? If I have to change the way I talk or the way I write and just not take it for granted that, you know, I just do things the way I always have. If I want to be relevant to a different type of reader or to a different type of student, then I have to actually try to be relevant. I can't just assume that it would be. So at the future of whatever it is, whether it's business or government or music or television, the greatest innovation is going to happen when you actually care enough about what you're trying to enable as much as the experience that you're hoping to deliver.
I get the idea you're giving. So do you have any, I guess, like just initial concrete baby steps for us as employees thinking about our own teams and our own leaders, just about how to start implementing some of the ideas that you're talking about here?
So I'll start with just talking to the team or talking to users to get a better understanding of what it is that they're experiencing, what they're feeling, what a day in the life of is like, their opportunities, their frustrations, their challenges. And I do it one-on-one. So it's not like a focus group, it's like an interview, like a therapy session. Because then when you disarm those who you're talking to, you get the truth. And in the truth, and this has yet to fail me, by the way, in the truth comes insights. And when you present those truths back to the team, there's a lot of surprise. And often, like the 1s and 5s in a review, there's often surprise and there's often denial. And what ends up happening, though, is like that experience divide. There's just always a divide of what you think you're doing and what's really felt and what's happening. But also within that divide, though, comes this idea of what your next steps would be to close it. It becomes purposeful. And that always works. People align around that. If they don't, then they don't care. But I haven't seen that happen. But when they can align around something, it's purposeful. That's where it always starts. It's not a complex process. It's just a process of understanding. It's like that undercover boss moment. You're just walking in the steps to better understand what's happening, what's feeling.
And so thank you, first of all, for coming out and talking to us. But so I really like the part where you said that with the Pebble Watch, the people who commented on the 1s probably could have been brought up to 2, 3, or 4s with just engagement. But in this progressing world where engagement is becoming more and more important, do you think if you can only have one, is personalization or consistency more important in your engagement with your customers?
I actually think that consistency is probably going to outweigh personalization, at least initially, because in that Pebble example, there's no uniformity in the solution. There is a uniformity in the problem. I mean, it's just consistent. You read every review, even those that have great reviews, it's just the problem is consistent. So anyway, in that regard, what if you just aimed for consistency in the experience that people are going to have? What if you aimed for consistency in the promise delivery? Maybe it's not the right promise, but you were consistent with the promise. From there, though, the idea of personalization, I think, can be unlocked. It's almost harder to create alignment between the desired experience and the experience people have. If you can do that, people become a form of engagement for you, right? It's almost like advocacy. And that could have been solved for you. When you look at the best products, there is a sense of uniformity because the experience is what was designed, and it creates this excitement or this enthusiasm within the community where people will actually start to answer other people's questions. So this is going to sound silly, but it's true for the Vitamix blender world, by the way, which I just found out is a church. People are really religious about this blender, and they are answering all of the questions that people have about it before anybody from Vitamix can even get to it. I haven't seen anybody from Vitamix do that. Not to say they're not, but in every case, the idea of consistency was delivered in the product, and therefore the idea of personalization came from peer to peer. So pretty interesting in that regard. Any other questions? Well, as an analyst, right, when I try to solve for businesses who actually want to survive, I'm almost like a lawyer. I have all the evidence that's necessary to fight my case, to say, look, we're actually on a path to irrelevance than we are on a path to relevance. The reason why there isn't a prescription is because it's never a problem of just them not wanting to do the right thing. It's always a cultural problem of them thinking that they're doing the right thing, and that everything that they've learned, everything that they do on a daily basis is sort of managing the business in a direction that they believe it to be most successful. So this is why the idea of anthropology came at least into my world. The stakeholder interview thing is interesting because when I report out to an executive at a company and they actually see that what they think is happening and what they're managing toward is not the reality, it always creates very interesting discussions. And what they always do after that is they form, I'm just using enterprise words, their words, not mine, is they form either a steering committee or a task force to go learn more about it. This has to do with part innovation, so they'll move people here to Silicon Valley to talk to you, to talk to other companies to see what's on the horizon, what's trending, what are they learning. They'll also look to their folks in the social media department, for example, to listen. What's taking place? What are we hearing? What are we not missing? But in every case, the problem is the bottom line. When you look at that stat about companies that turned over, there was one time when Kodak was incredibly profitable. So the one thing that I hear every time is that, look, our last quarter was this. Why do we even need to listen to you? And it becomes a culture of management rather than a culture of leadership. There's an interesting infographic that's going around over the last couple of days that showed the number of executives who either got bailed out, who got fired with the golden parachute, and ultimately how many of those folks drove those companies into the ground. What creates this demise is anything and everything. A lot of times it's greed, a lack of transparency, a lack of leadership. So that's why the problem is there isn't a prescription. I do think that the solution, though, is around creating the desired experiences around that meet expectations, or at least beat what it is that customers expect. At the back of the book, I talk about the psychology of change. How do you get somebody to see that there's a problem with smoking? And then how do you get them to quit smoking in order to do something differently, right? So a lot of this, I realized, was part politician, part lawyer, not just building the case, but also championing the case. Creating, in every case, what ends up convincing someone who's preserving power. They understand that there's a way to get more power by thinking differently or investing in an alternative strategy. So you almost have to feed into it, and very rarely does it happen because they saw it. It happened because the team that they've surrounded themselves with to insulate them has said that this is the direction that they have to go. So in many cases, the team that surrounds the decision maker is not the team that sees the opportunity either. So for us, for me, every single time I have to get, that's good old-fashioned politics. I have to get what I need because I see an opportunity, because I did the math to see that it's an opportunity, and then get an executive sponsor that's in that inner circle to at least allow me to prove it. When that happens, then that inner circle invests in this innovation committee, this steering committee, this task force, and then they're chartered with tangible things to bring about change. So what ends up happening is that 3, 4, 5 years from now, those little pilots have added into an augmented or a complementary program that brings about change. It doesn't just say, look, we're going to compete for the future and we're going double down on all of this stuff. It's incremental. So I look at the Tata Group, right, out of India. And the one thing that I like about them is that they didn't know the answer. They didn't know how to stay competitive or how to stay innovative. So they put it in the hands of their employees to just innovate. Made it part of the culture. They said management had to take ideas and that they would then be measured by how they translated those ideas into programs. It was a cultural thing. Now, that's led to very interesting things like low-cost cars, a lot of improvements in processes. But in that regard, the leader of the organization said that there's an opportunity here. In other ways, you have to create that opportunity. It has to become part of culture, and the only way to do that is to get it into the inner circle to affect the ultimate decision maker, because nothing happens from the bottom up. It always has to happen from the top down. It's complicated, hence ending the book on all of these psychological steps to get people to see and how to fight for change. And one of the things that I'll bring, and I'll bring it back to higher level, but there is no easy answer, right? I was really inspired by Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, because in the hero's journey there was this common path that mythological leaders had followed, and there was a lot of challenge, a lot of doubt, a lot of renaissance, and I sort of adapted that, saying you're going to be met with every obstacle that's going to dissuade you from doing what you want to do. It's not even in your job description, your responsibility to try to bring about this type of change, but there's a great reward for it, and here's 21 steps to follow to at least have a shot at it and to create strength or unity around you. Because without it, waiting for it to come from the top down it's just not going to happen, right? That's why Kodak is what it is. I spent about 5 years of research looking at all the companies that just failed, and I created an infographic around it, and it's sobering to say the least. But there wasn't one common thing that led to the demise of some of the brands that we all grew up with, But what was common was just this inability to see that there were alternative possibilities for the future. And that's why I think that that hero's journey, what this really starts to inspire, is what happens if you and I can just start to try to answer this question and start to try to bring about the change, or at least create the need for change, or make a case for an opportunity for change. And then you become the best practices or the series of steps that we follow. And that's the book that I hope to write next. And I wanted to try to spark a revolution around that. So, guys, thank you for your time and attention this afternoon, and enjoy the long weekend.